The cold seeped into her bones, a familiar ache that had nothing to do with the wind and everything to do with the gnawing hollowness inside her. It was the chill of 1,000 averted gazes, of whispers that clung to her like grave dust. The writhing, shadow-like mark on her skin was not a blemish. It was a verdict, a declaration of her unlovable nature etched into her very flesh. Every dawn she awoke with the crushing weight of this truth. She was a blight, a stain upon the world meant only for chains and servitude. This feeling is a universal one, a loneliness that transcends borders. It makes me wonder, where are you watching this from right now? Go ahead and comment with your city, the time of day, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey together. Her world was a tapestry woven from the threads of survival. Each day a struggle for a stale crust of bread or a place to sleep sheltered from the biting rain. She lived on the fringes of the elven woods, a ghost haunting the edge of a society that wished her gone. The other elves, with their ethereal grace and luminous skin, would flinch as if struck when they saw the living shadow that coiled from her wrist to her shoulder. Their fear was a physical blow, reinforcing the walls around her heart. She learned to read contempt in the tightening of a jaw, disgust in the narrowing of an eye. This constant rejection had whittled her down, leaving a desperate, secret dream buried beneath layers of shame. A yearning for a place where her curse was not a brand of damnation, but a source of unspoken power. That fragile dream shattered into 1,000,000 pieces the day they came for her. Rough hands seized her, dragging her from her meager shelter with the indifference one would show a stray dog. The ropes bit into her skin, a cruel confirmation of her deepest fears. They forced her through the squalor of a human market, a chaotic symphony of smells, rotting fish, unwashed bodies, and cheap ale that choked her senses. She was paraded on a crude wooden block, a cursed object for sale. The auctioneer's voice boomed, listing her flaws and the novelty of her mark. Humiliation burned hotter than any sun, a searing acid that dissolved what little dignity she had left. She was no longer Ilara. She was a commodity, her fate to be decided by the weight of a stranger's coin purse. Suddenly, a hush fell over the boisterous crowd, a wave of silence so profound it was like a physical force. Through the parting sea of awe-struck humans and nervous merchants, he appeared, Kalen, the Elf King of Silverwood, mounted on a great white stag whose antlers seemed to catch the very light of the sky. He was a figure from legend, clad in silver-wrought armor that gleamed against the filth of the market. His royal guard, their faces masks of disbelief and disapproval, flanked him. But the king's eyes, the color of a stormy winter sky, saw none of them. They were fixed solely on her, a gaze so intense and penetrating it stripped away the noise, the smells, the shame, leaving only a terrifying, magnetic pull that stopped the very breath in her lungs. He dismounted with a fluid grace that defied the mud sucking at his boots, his presence a stark, radiant contrast to the grime around him. The crowd held its collective breath as he moved toward the auction block, his steps deliberate and unwavering. He ignored the sputtering auctioneer and the gasps of his own retinue. Reaching her, he drew a slender, silver blade from his belt, its edge shimmering with a faint light. He did not speak. With a single, decisive motion, he sliced through the coarse rope binding her wrists. The act was public, shocking, and deeply personal. As the severed rope fell away, Ilara looked up into his unreadable face, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was no rescue. It was a claim, a silent, binding declaration that promised not freedom, but a fate far more complicated and perilous than the one she had just escaped. As the memory of the market faded, replaced by the silent, imposing presence of the king's guard, Ilara's mind retreated to the only place it knew, the jagged landscape of her past. Her first memory was not of a mother's gentle touch or a father's smile, but of a sharp, horrified gasp. She recalled the sensation of being held, and then, abruptly, almost violently, set down, as if she were a hot coal. The faces above her, the ones that should have been her family, were contorted not with love, but with a primal fear and revulsion. They were looking at the dark, swirling blemish on her infant skin, a mark that had sealed her fate before she could even speak her own name. She was cast out, left at the edge of the woods, an offering to the indifference of nature. Her life began not with a welcome, but with the profound, soul-crushing certainty of being utterly and completely unwanted. The years that followed were a blur of cold and hunger, a masterclass in becoming invisible. She learned the rhythms of the forest and the back alleys of the elven settlements, surviving on discarded scraps and the rare, pitying kindness of a stranger who didn't look too closely. The other elven children were the cruelest. They called her shadow-stained and blight-born, their taunts echoing the silent contempt of their parents. They threw stones not just to injure her body, but to reinforce the social chasm between them, the purebloods and the cursed thing that haunted their periphery. Each slammed door, each averted gaze, each whispered insult was another brick in the wall she built around her heart. She learned early that hope was a dangerous luxury, and that the only person she could ever rely on was herself, a lonely sentinel guarding a fortress of pain. The mark on her skin was more than a disfigurement. It was a constant, living reminder of her otherness. In the quiet of the night, she would trace its intricate, shadow-like patterns, feeling a faint, unsettling warmth beneath her fingertips. It seemed to pulse with her own heartbeat, a parasitic twin tethered to her soul. The scorn of the world had seeped inward, becoming a venomous inner voice that told her she was grotesque, a walking corruption. This internalized disgust was her deepest wound, a poison that tainted any potential for joy. She could not see her own reflection without seeing the flaw, the verdict of the gods etched into her flesh. This belief that she was inherently unlovable was not just an opinion, it was the fundamental truth upon which her entire existence was built. Because of this deep-seated conviction, the concept of romance was a cruel and distant fiction. It was a story told for other people, for the luminous, unblemished elves who danced in the moonlight and exchanged vows under ancient trees. The idea of someone willingly reaching for her hand, of looking at the swirling shadows on her arm with anything other than revulsion, was so preposterous it bordered on madness. She once hid in the bushes and watched a young couple share a stolen kiss, their faces illuminated with a tenderness so profound it felt like a physical blow. The sight filled her not with longing, but with a bitter, hollow ache, a confirmation that such warmth was a language she would never speak, a world from which she was eternally barred. Her life was a relentless cycle of survival, a brutal calculus of risk and reward that left no room for daydreams. Every waking moment was dedicated to the pragmatic pursuit of her next meal, or a dry place to sleep, her senses honed to detect danger and opportunity. The weight of this responsibility had forged her into something hard and sharp-edged. She could not afford the softness of vulnerability or the naivete of trust. To let her guard down, even for a moment, could mean starvation or capture. This constant state of high alert had stripped away her capacity for connection, leaving behind a creature of instinct and fierce self-preservation. She saw the world not as a place of wonder and possibility, but as a series of obstacles to be overcome until the next sunrise. Yet, buried beneath the layers of scar tissue and pragmatism, a secret dream festered in the darkness. It was a fragile, dangerous thing she rarely dared to acknowledge. She did not dream of love or riches, but of purpose. She harbored a desperate, unspoken fantasy that her curse was not a random blight, but a sign, a source of some hidden power or destiny that she couldn't comprehend. She imagined a world where the mark was not a brand of shame but a key, a symbol that set her apart for greatness rather than scorn. This foolish, childish hope was her most guarded secret and her greatest vulnerability. It was the one dream that, if discovered and extinguished, would surely break the last vestiges of her spirit and leave her truly empty. The journey from the chaotic human market to the heart of the Elven Kingdom was a silent, surreal ordeal. Flanked by Kaelin's royal guard, whose immaculate silver armor seemed to radiate a cold disapproval, Ilara was escorted toward a future she could not begin to imagine. They moved with an unnerving speed, leaving the world of men behind and entering the ethereal, shimmering light of Silverwood. She was led not to a dungeon, but toward the magnificent royal palace, its spires piercing the sky like needles of spun moonlight. The towering gates, intricately carved with the history of a proud and ancient people, swung open without a sound. She was being brought into the very heart of the society that had cast her out. As she stepped across the threshold, her bare feet touching the cool, polished stone, she saw him waiting in the grand hall. King Kaelin stood alone, his stormy eyes fixed on her, and a new, more profound terror seized her, the terrifying uncertainty of his intentions. In the cavernous grand hall, King Kaelin stood as a figure carved from winter stone and starlight. His physical presence was an exercise in contradictions. The ethereal grace of his elven lineage was hardened by the sharp, pragmatic lines of a warrior king. Silver threads, premature for one of his kind, streaked through his raven-black hair, hinting at the immense burden he carried. His armor was gone, replaced by a simple, dark tunic that did little to soften the formidable power coiled in his frame. But it was his eyes that held the true story, the color of a gathering storm. They surveyed his ancestral hall, not with pride, but with the weary vigilance of a man watching his world slowly crumble to dust. He radiated an aura of absolute command, a dominance so profound it felt like a physical pressure in the air. Yet beneath it lay the cold, brittle fear of a king ruling a dying kingdom. The political pressures he faced were a constant, suffocating siege. His council, a collection of ancient, prideful lords led by the cunning and xenophobic Valerius, was his greatest obstacle. They clung to traditions that were strangling their civilization, preaching arcane purity and complete isolation from the world of men. Kaelin's public act of claiming a cursed human from a filthy market was not just a political misstep in their eyes. It was heresy, a deep stain upon the honor of their pristine lineage. They whispered of his madness, of his unfitness to rule, using his desperate act to stoke fear and unrest among the court. Every day was a battle of wills, a tightrope walk between placating their dangerous pride and taking the radical steps necessary to avert their collective doom. A doom they refused to see. This doom had a name. The Withering. It was not a swift plague or a violent war, but a slow, creeping blight that leached the very life from his world. The ancestral forests of Silverwood, once shimmering with vibrant, magical life, were now tinged with a creeping grey, their leaves crumbling to dust at the slightest touch. The luminous streams that flowed with latent magic now ran sluggish and dim. Most devastating of all, the Withering had rendered his people sterile. For a race defined by its near immortality and the continuity of its ancient bloodlines, this silent, creeping infertility was the ultimate horror. It was a sentence of extinction, a slow, beautiful, and protracted death for his entire civilization, and he was the king forced to preside over its funeral. Beneath the crown and the unyielding facade of command, Kaelin was a man profoundly alone. As the last of his direct royal line, the weight of his people's future rested solely upon his shoulders. He walked the silent, echoing halls of a palace built for a thriving dynasty, each step a reminder of the future that would never be. The portraits of his ancestors seemed to watch him with accusing eyes, their painted gazes a constant reminder of the legacy he was failing to protect. This crushing solitude was his most closely guarded secret, a vulnerability hidden behind a mask of stoic resolve. He feared not for his own life, but for the final, silent breath of his entire culture, a fear so immense it threatened to shatter the very foundations of his being. His desperate gambit was born from forbidden knowledge. In a dusty, heretical text hidden deep within the royal archives, he had found a single, desperate prophecy. It spoke of a time when the heart of the elves would grow cold and their light would fade, and that only a mortal, touched by the living shadow, could act as a conduit to rekindle the dying magic. The swirling mark on Ilara's skin was not a curse to him. It was the fulfillment of that prophecy, a terrifying, beautiful sign of hope in a world devoid of it. His actions in the market were not random. They were the calculated, high-stakes move of a desperate man staking the last hope of his civilization on a woman the rest of the world saw as a blight. He needed her, not in spite of her curse, but because of it. Standing before the ancient throne, Kaelin made his decision. The political firestorm was already brewing, and he had no time to waste on appeasing the fools on his council. The key to their salvation was now within his walls, frightened and confused, but here he turned to his captain of the guard, a stoic elf whose loyalty was absolute, his face an unreadable mask. The king's voice was low, devoid of emotion, yet it carried the undeniable weight of a royal command that would change the course of their history. "Bring her to me, now!" The order echoed in the vast, empty hall. Miles away, in a guest chamber that felt more like a gilded cage, Ilara flinched as the heavy doors swung open. The summons had come, and in her heart she knew it was not an invitation, but a final judgment. The guards left them in a silence so profound it seemed to drink the very air from the throne room. Ilara stood on the polished obsidian floor, a small, defiant figure dwarfed by the cavernous space and the immense, unyielding presence of the king before her. Kaelin remained by the ancient throne, not seated upon it, but standing beside it as if it were a fellow sentinel. The air between them crackled with an invisible energy, a gravitational pull of power and vulnerability. He did not move, his stormy grey eyes fixed on her, not with the revulsion she expected, but with a sharp, unnerving intensity that felt more invasive than any physical touch. It was the gaze of a master craftsman studying a rare, volatile, and essential tool. For the first time in her life, she was not being dismissed or feared. She was being evaluated, and the feeling was infinitely more terrifying. He finally broke the suffocating silence, his voice a low, resonant timbre that seemed to carry the weight of the stone hall itself. "They call you the Cursed," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact he was setting aside. "They see a blight, a stain upon the world. They are fools, blinded by fear and tradition." He took a single, deliberate step toward her, and she fought the instinct to recoil. "I do not see a curse. I see a key. I see the last and only hope for a dying people." The words hung in the air, a shocking refutation of her entire existence. Everything she had been taught to believe about herself, that she was worthless, a grotesque mistake, was being methodically dismantled by the most powerful elf in the world, leaving her standing on a precipice of bewildering uncertainty, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Kaelin's gaze drifted past her, toward the grand arched windows that overlooked the heart of his kingdom. "My world is fading, Ilara. We are afflicted by a blight of our own, a creeping silence we call the Withering. It leaches the magic from our soil, it crumbles our ancient forests to dust, and it has stolen the future from our children's cradles. We are becoming a race of ghosts, haunting the beautiful corpse of our own civilization." He turned his gaze back to her, and for a fleeting moment, The mask of the unyielding monarch slipped, revealing a glimpse of the profound, crushing despair beneath. My Council of Lords preaches purity and isolation as a cure, but they are merely arranging the finery for our funeral. They would rather we perish in pristine silence than seek a solution that offends their pride. His voice hardened again, the vulnerability sealed away behind a wall of cold pragmatism. I am the last of my line, the weight of my ancestors, the future of my people. It rests entirely on me, and I will not be the king who presides over our extinction. He gestured to the swirling, shadow-like mark on her arm, the source of all her pain. Ancient, forbidden texts speak of a prophecy. They say that when the heart of our magic grows cold, only a mortal, touched by the living shadow, can act as a conduit to rekindle it. Your mark is not a random affliction from the gods. It is a sign, a living vessel for a power we have lost, a power that is antithetical to our own fading light, and therefore the only thing that can reignite it. I did not save you from that market out of pity. I claimed you out of desperation. The sheer audacity of his words stole her breath. He was proposing to use her, to wield her curse as a weapon against his own kingdom's doom. The fragile, secret dream she had harbored, that her mark held a hidden purpose, was being laid bare as a terrifying reality. It was not a gift, but a burden of world-altering consequence. He saw the conflict warring in her eyes, the fear and the flicker of a desperate hope she could not entirely extinguish. He closed the remaining distance between them, his presence overwhelming her senses. He was close enough now that she could feel the faint coolness radiating from him, a stark contrast to the unsettling warmth that had begun to pulse from the mark on her skin in his proximity. He was a force of nature, a winter storm making a demand of a single, broken branch. I cannot bring a cursed human into my court without being deposed before the next moon, he stated, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was both intimate and chilling. The lords would see it as proof of my madness. They would tear you apart. Therefore, I offer you a different cage than the one you have known, a gilded one. He paused, letting the weight of his proposal settle. I am offering you a marriage. You will become my queen, you will wear my crown, live in my palace, and command the respect that my name provides. You will be untouchable. In return for this protection, this life of luxury and power beyond your imagining, you will be my partner in this. In secret, you will help me perform the rituals to heal this land. You will be the Queen of Silverwood. Ilara's mind reeled, struggling to process the monumental, impossible proposition. A queen, the shadow-stained, the blight-born, the girl who fought for scraps in the dirt, was being offered a crown. It was a cruel joke, a fantasy so absurd it bordered on madness. She looked into his eyes, searching for the lie, the trick, the hidden barb in this beautiful, poisoned bait. But she saw only a desperate, unwavering resolve that mirrored her own lifelong fight for survival. This was not a rescue. It was a transaction. He was offering to trade her chains of iron for chains of golden silk. She would be a pawn, a beautiful, decorated tool in his high-stakes game. Yet, a pawn on the board was still better than being swept off it entirely. The alternative was a return to a life of scorn, hunger, and the certainty of a brutal, meaningless end. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting his with a newfound strength forged in the fires of his revelation. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now joined by a spark of defiance. She had been a survivor her entire life, and she would survive this too. She would not be a passive instrument for his salvation. If she was to be his key, she would have a say in which doors were unlocked. Her voice, though quiet, did not tremble as she gave him her answer. "I accept your proposal, Your Majesty," she said, the formal title feeling alien on her tongue. "I will be your queen and your key." A flicker of relief crossed his features, but it vanished as she continued, her voice hardening with the weight of a life spent with nothing. "But I have one condition." Kaelin's stormy eyes narrowed, a flicker of something unreadable. Surprise, perhaps even a sliver of respect, passing through their depths. He had expected fear, compliance, or a desperate plea for riches, but not a demand for agency. Her condition hung in the air between them, a fragile shield against his overwhelming power. "My condition," Ilara repeated, her voice gaining a measure of strength she did not know she possessed, "is that I will not be your blind instrument. You will not simply use me, you will teach me. I want to understand this power, this curse. I want to know what it is you are asking me to wield, to understand the rituals you plan. If my fate is to be the key to your kingdom's salvation, then I will be the one who helps turn it in the lock, not merely the metal to be forced." It was a monumental gamble, a challenge to a king who could crush her with a word. But she would not trade one form of servitude for another, no matter how gilded the cage. A long, tense silence stretched, filled only by the distant echo of a guard's footsteps in the corridor. Kaelin regarded her, his expression a mask of cold calculation, but his mind was racing. Her audacity was as unexpected as the prophecy itself. She was not a simple, broken thing to be molded to his will. She was a survivor, with a core of tempered steel forged in the fires of a lifetime of scorn. He saw in that moment that her demand was not a weakness to be exploited, but a strength he could use. A willing, knowledgeable partner would be infinitely more effective than a terrified, ignorant tool. He gave a single, sharp nod, the gesture as binding as any signed treaty. "Agreed," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You will have the knowledge you seek. But in return, your loyalty must be absolute. The secrets we share will be bound to your very soul. Betray me, and the wrath of my court will be the least of your concerns." The ceremony was a whirlwind of cold efficiency, a political necessity executed with breathtaking speed. Ilara was stripped of her rags and plunged into a world of bewildering luxury. Handmaidens, with expressions of barely concealed revulsion, scrubbed her skin raw, their hands flinching whenever they neared the shadow mark on her arm. They dressed her in a gown of silver silk so fine it felt like moonlight against her skin, its weight a constant, alien reminder of the role she was about to play. A delicate circlet of winterthorn and diamonds was placed on her head, its cold touch a stark contrast to the burning anxiety in her chest. When she finally saw her reflection in a polished silver mirror, she did not recognize the woman staring back. It was a queen's visage, a beautiful, terrifying lie, and beneath it, the same lost, cursed girl was screaming in silence. They were married in the great throne hall, under the cold, judgmental gaze of the entire Silverwood court. The air was thick with a hostile silence, a collective holding of breath that felt more suffocating than any shout. Lord Valerius stood at the forefront, his face a perfect mask of aristocratic disdain, his eyes like chips of ice as they followed her every move. The whispers were like the rustling of snakes in dry leaves, words like human, blight, and sacrilege slithering through the assembly. Kaelin stood beside her, an immovable pillar of regal authority. His presence was her only shield, a formidable wall of power that deflected the venomous glares of his subjects. He did not look at them. His attention was fixed forward, his jaw set like granite, a king forcing his will upon a disbelieving world, daring anyone to challenge him. The high priest, an ancient elf whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles and disapproval, recited the binding vows in a trembling monotone. The words were ancient, speaking of eternal bonds and the merging of two souls into one, a bitter irony that was lost on no one present. When it was her turn, Ilara's voice was a quiet but steady thread in the vast, silent hall. "I bind my fate to yours," she recited, the words feeling foreign and heavy on her tongue. She met Kaelin's gaze, and in that moment the rest of the world fell away. They were two conspirators on a brightly lit stage, speaking a coded language. The vows were not of love, but of mutual desperation. A secret pact, sealed in public view. He was binding her to his cause, and she was binding him to his promise of protection and knowledge. Then came the moment that would forever alter the cold calculus of their arrangement. The priest declared them bound, and Kaelin turned to face her. The ceremonial kiss was meant to be a formality, a brief, chaste gesture to seal the public ritual. He leaned in, his movements controlled and precise. But as his lips met hers, a jolt, sharp and electric, shot through her entire body. It was not a spark of passion, but a surge of raw, untamed power. A wave of warmth erupted from the mark on her arm, flooding her veins with a dizzying energy. She felt his breath hitch in surprise, his body go rigid against hers. His hand, which had been resting formally on her waist, tightened with bruising force, his control momentarily shattering. For a fraction of a second, it was not a king and his pawn, but a man and a woman, caught in a powerful, unexpected current that threatened to pull them both under. When he pulled away, his eyes were wide with a flicker of shock he could not entirely conceal. The court saw only a kiss, but Kaelin and Elara felt the aftershock of a magical detonation. As he led her from the dais, his hand now firmly gripping her arm, the atmosphere in the hall shifted from shocked silence to a low, venomous hum. The nobles no longer looked merely disgusted, they looked afraid. They had witnessed their king, a being of pure elven lineage, willingly join himself to a source of unclean human power, and the kiss seemed to have been a physical manifestation of that unholy union. Lord Valerius's gaze was no longer just contemptuous, it was filled with a cold, calculating fury. He had not just witnessed a political misstep, he had witnessed the lighting of a fuse. And his expression promised he would do everything in his power to ensure the resulting explosion destroyed them both. The heavy, carved doors of the royal chambers closed behind them, shutting out the hostile world of the court and trapping them in an even more volatile silence. The public performance was over. They were husband and wife, king and queen, and they were utterly alone. Elara stood in the center of the lavish room, the silver silk of her gown pooling around her feet, feeling more like a captive than a bride. Kaelin moved to the far side of the chamber, his back to her as he stared out the window at the darkening sky. The energy from the kiss still thrummed beneath her skin, a terrifying and exhilarating hum. The air between them was thick with unspoken questions and the undeniable physical evidence that their pact was far more complicated and dangerous than either of them had anticipated. They were two strangers bound by a magical contract, a political lie, and now a shared, shocking secret. Finally, he turned from the window, his face etched with a tension that mirrored her own. His gaze fell upon the intricate series of clasps running down the back of her gown, an impossible puzzle for her to solve alone. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, the silence broken only by the soft sound of his boots on the stone floor. He stopped directly behind her, his proximity raising the fine hairs on her arms. Without a word, he began to undo the clasps. His fingers were cool and deliberate as they brushed against the skin of her back, each touch sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. The simple, necessary act was more intimate than the public kiss, a quiet, personal moment that stripped away their royal titles and left them as just a man and a woman, trapped in a gilded cage of their own making. With the last clasp undone, the heavy gown slid from her shoulders, pooling at her feet and leaving her standing in a simple silk shift. She did not move, her breath caught in her throat. Kaelin took a step back, putting a careful distance between them once more. The chamber was silent, the air thick with the scent of winter jasmine and unresolved tension. She could feel the mark on her arm, pulsing with a faint, warm light, a visible reaction to his nearness. He looked at her then, and the storm in his eyes had changed. The cold calculation of the king was gone, replaced by something far more unsettling, a deep, probing curiosity that saw past the cursed girl and the sham queen. "The vows are spoken. The court is in an uproar," he said, his voice a low murmur that filled the cavernous room. "Now the real work begins." The words were a simple statement of fact, but his intense gaze promised a journey into a darkness far more profound than any political intrigue. A dangerous alliance where the lines of their cold bargain were already beginning to blur into oblivion. The days settled into a strange, quiet rhythm, a fragile truce in the war between their public roles and their private reality. Their true work began not in grand rituals, but in the dusty, forgotten corners of the royal library. Surrounded by the scent of ancient parchment and dried ink, Kalen became her tutor. He unveiled the forbidden texts, his low voice a steady murmur as he explained the arcane theories behind the withering and the nature of her mark. He spoke of magic not as the elves knew it, an innate, luminous force, but as a balance of light and shadow. In these quiet hours, the king and the cursed girl vanished, replaced by a teacher and his unnervingly adept student. She absorbed the knowledge with a desperate thirst, and he watched her, a flicker of something akin to pride, or perhaps wonder, in his stormy eyes as he saw the sharp, resilient mind that had been forged in the crucible of survival. The lines of their arrangement began to blur in these stolen moments of tranquility, the cold, hard edges of their pact softening with an unwelcome warmth. One evening, after hours of study, Elara fell asleep at the great oak table, her head pillowed on a heavy, leather-bound tome. Kalen, about to wake her, found himself hesitating. The exhaustion on her face smoothed away the defiant mask she wore for the court, revealing a vulnerability that struck him with an unexpected force. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above her cheek, a silent debate raging within him. With a quiet sigh, he instead retrieved a heavy fur cloak from a nearby chair and gently draped it over her shoulders. The act was simple, protective, and entirely outside the bounds of their contract. As he watched her stir softly in her sleep, a dangerous question echoed in the silent library. Were they truly just pretending? Their private world was shattered during a formal walk through the palace's winter gardens. The air was crisp, and the skeletal branches of the ancient trees were dusted with a fine layer of frost. A group of high-born ladies, led by the sharp-tongued Lady Lyra, intercepted them with practiced smiles that did not reach their cold, assessing eyes. "Your Majesty," Lyra said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she curtsied to Kalen, her gaze sliding dismissively over Elara. "Your new queen is resilient, like the hardy, common weeds that thrive in harsher soils." The insult was as sharp and cold as an icicle, a clear reminder to Elara that no matter the crown on her head or the king at her side, to them she would always be nothing more than an invasive species, a blight upon their pristine, manicured world. The other ladies tittered behind their hands, their laughter like the cracking of ice. The Elara who once would have flinched and retreated into herself was gone, replaced by a queen, however reluctant. She met Lady Lyra's venomous gaze with a calm she did not feel, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "You are correct, Lady Lyra," Elara replied, her voice even and clear, carrying easily in the cold air. "Weeds are resilient. They must be, for they are not afforded the luxury of a sheltered garden. They must find their own light and draw strength from the very ground that others deem unworthy." She paused, letting her words sink in, her eyes never leaving the noblewoman's. "There is a certain power in that, don't you think? To bloom not because you are cared for, but in spite of the fact that you are not." A stunned silence fell over the group, and beside her, Elara felt rather than saw Kalen's subtle shift, a silent acknowledgement of the steel in her spine. The incident in the garden was a mere tremor before the earthquake. Kalen's counsel, led by the perpetually sneering Lord Valerius, formally summoned them. They sat on their twin thrones before the assembly of grim-faced lords, the air thick with hostility. Valerius rose, his movements slow and deliberate, a predator circling his prey. "Your Majesty," he began, addressing Cailan but fixing his cruel gaze upon Ilara, "we have indulged this union, but the court has questions. A queen must be more than a pretty bauble on the king's arm. She must be a custodian of our culture, a vessel of our history." He then turned fully to her, a malicious smirk playing on his lips. "Tell us, Queen Ilara, what are the 3 binding laws of the First Accord, and how did they secure the sovereignty of Silverwood against the encroaching kingdoms of men?" The question was a perfectly crafted trap, a piece of arcane historical lore she could not possibly know, designed to publicly expose her as an ignorant, unworthy fraud. A wave of cold dread washed over Ilara, chilling her to the bone. The room swam before her eyes, the faces of the elven lords blurring into a single, condemning mask of scorn. It was the market all over again, the auction block replaced by a throne, the auctioneer's voice replaced by Valerius's silken poison, all her old insecurities, the deep-seated belief in her own worthlessness, rushed back with the force of a tidal wave. She was an impostor, a cursed girl playing dress-up in a queen's clothes, and they all knew it. The silence in the chamber stretched, becoming a physical weight that pressed down on her, suffocating her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She had no answer. Her mind was a blank slate of humiliation, and in that moment she felt the gilded cage he had built around her shrink into a pillory. Before the silence could curdle into a verdict of her failure, Cailan's voice cut through the tension like a blade of ice. "Enough." The single word was spoken without volume, yet it cracked through the hall with the force of a thunderclap, making every lord in the room flinch. He rose from his throne, not in a fury, but with a cold, lethal calm that was far more terrifying. He moved to stand slightly in front of Ilara, a living shield of silver and shadow. "You ask my wife of our history, Lord Valerius? You seek to test her on the dusty laws of a past that has led us to this precipice of extinction." His stormy eyes swept over the council, pinning each lord in place. "Her knowledge is not of our dying past. It is of our only possible future. This woman, whom you so eagerly scorn, holds a power you cannot comprehend. She is not a custodian of our history. She is the key to our survival. She is your queen." Cailan's voice dropped, becoming a low, dangerous rumble that promised retribution. "Not by my decree alone, but by the will of a fate that has deemed her essential to our very existence. You will afford her the respect that title demands, not for my sake, and not for hers, but for the sake of every elven life that now depends on her." He then turned his gaze directly onto Valerius, and the full, unbridled power of the King of Silverwood focused on him like a spear point. "Any further attempt to undermine her authority will be considered an act of treason against the crown and the future of our race. Do you understand me, my lord?" The threat was absolute, unveiled, and utterly shocking in its public declaration. He was not just defending his political choice. He was defending her, personally and unequivocally, tying his reign to her fate in a way that could never be undone. The council chamber, which had been a tribunal, was now a tomb. Valerius stood frozen, his face a mask of pale, seething fury, the public rebuke a wound that would surely fester into a deeper poison. The other lords stared, their expressions a mixture of fear and disbelief. Cailan returned to Ilara's side, and in a move that sent a collective gasp through the assembly, he took her hand in his grip firm and reassuring. He helped her to her feet and led her from the throne room, leaving the stunned council in their wake. He did not let go of her hand as they walked the long, silent corridors back to their chambers. The warmth of his skin against hers was a grounding anchor in the storm of her emotions. He had not just saved her from humiliation, he had stood before his entire court and declared her essential, worthy, and untouchable. He had given her a shield forged from his own power. Back within the sanctuary of their chambers, the heavy doors closing behind them, the silence returned. But it was different now. It was not a silence of distance and uncertainty, but one charged with the raw, potent aftermath of the confrontation. Ilara stood trembling, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving her feeling hollowed out and raw. Kaelan finally released her hand, the loss of his touch leaving her skin feeling cold. He crossed the room and poured 2 goblets of deep red wine, his movements precise and controlled, betraying none of the immense pressure he was under. He brought one to her, his fingers brushing against hers as she took it. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she saw past the king and the strategist. She saw the man who had just gambled his entire reign to defend her honor, and her heart ached with a terrifying, unfamiliar emotion. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate for what he had done. He simply gave a short, sharp nod, his eyes holding hers. The storm in their depths was churning with a complex mix of emotions she couldn't begin to decipher. "Valerius will not forget this," he stated, his voice a low murmur. "He will come for us, for both of us, with more venom than before." It was not a warning, but a statement of fact. An acknowledgement that they had crossed a threshold together. He had drawn a battle line, and he had placed her firmly on his side of it. This shared danger, this public alliance, was a bond far stronger than the cold vows they had spoken. The space between them hummed with this new reality, a perilous intimacy born from a public fight for her dignity. The question of whether they were pretending no longer seemed to matter. Their fates were now irrevocably and dangerously intertwined. But the victory in the council, as Kaelan predicted, was short-lived. Valerius, though silenced, was not defeated. He changed his tactics from direct assault to insidious poison. A week later, at a grand feast, he rose to offer a toast. "To the king and his new queen," he proclaimed, his voice ringing with false sincerity. "And to the future of Silverwood." He paused, letting the attention of the entire court settle on him. A future that rests, as it always has, on the continuation of the royal line. A kingdom's strength is in its succession. His eyes glinted as he looked directly at Kaelan and Ilara, seated on their thrones. "We all pray that this union will soon be blessed with a child, an heir to secure our legacy." The words fell into the hall with the weight of stones, a new, impossible demand that twisted their secret pact into a cruel public spectacle. The pressure had shifted from her legitimacy to her fertility, a subject that touched upon the deepest, most painful secret of their dying race. The oppressive weight of Valerius's toast settled over them like a funeral shroud, extinguishing the fragile warmth that had begun to grow in the quiet moments between them. In the days that followed, Kaelan became a ghost in his own palace, a king carved from ice and duty. He retreated behind the unbreachable walls of his authority, his conversations with her becoming clipped, formal, and agonizingly brief. The vast royal chambers, once a sanctuary from the court, now felt like a desolate tundra, the silence between them a howling wind. Ilara felt the gilded bars of her cage pressing in, the impossible demand for an heir a constant, mocking reminder of her otherness and the fundamental lie of their union. The man who had shielded her from the world's scorn now averted his gaze, and the loneliness she felt was sharper and more profound than any she had known in the gutters. For this time, she was mourning the loss of a connection she had just begun to believe was real. Unable to bear the suffocating distance any longer, Ilara sought him out, finding him in the highest turret of the palace, the royal observatory, where he stood silhouetted against a tapestry of dying stars. The cold glass reflected a king, burdened by more than a crown. When she demanded to know why he was letting Valerius's poison win, why he was destroying the tentative alliance they had built, his reply was a wall of cold, hard logic. He spoke of political necessities and the predictable machinations of the court, his voice devoid of the warmth she had come to crave. His detachment was a blade to her heart. "Did you truly believe this would be anything other than what it is?" he asked, his voice laced with a bitterness that felt directed as much at himself as at her. "You are the key, Elara. That has not changed." The words, once a source of shocking purpose, now sounded like a death sentence. Confirming her deepest fear, she was, and always would be, just a tool to be used. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and glittering with her unshed tears. For a moment, his mask of regal control shattered, replaced by a raw, desperate anguish. He strode to an ancient desk and slammed a brittle, yellowed scroll down upon its surface. "You think this is about an heir? You think my concern is for Valerius's petty games?" he snarled, his voice cracking with an emotion she couldn't name. He unrolled the parchment, revealing the elegant, flowing script of the prophecy. His finger trembled as he pointed to the final, damning line, a passage he had never shown her. "It says the conduit will burn bright to rekindle the heart of the land, but like any flame given too much fuel, it will be consumed in the process." The truth fell upon her with the force of a physical blow. The ritual to save Silverwood would require the ultimate price, her life. His distance wasn't rejection, it was the desperate self-preservation of a man trying not to care for the woman he was duty-bound to sacrifice. A maelstrom of betrayal and horror ripped through her. Every shared glance, every moment of quiet understanding, every act of protection was instantly rewritten in the horrifying light of this revelation. He was not her protector, he was her executioner, tending to his weapon before its final use. The shame and worthlessness that had defined her life coalesced into a single, searing point of agony. She was not just unlovable, she was disposable. Seeing the utter devastation on her face, Kaelin's voice broke. "I have spent every waking moment since you arrived searching for another way," he confessed, the words torn from him. "I have read every forbidden text, consulted every forgotten map. The thought of the ritual, of you—" He couldn't finish, the words catching in his throat. It was the closest he had ever come to speaking the truth of his heart, a declaration of love disguised as a confession of his own impending failure. He could save his kingdom, but he would lose the one thing that had begun to give his own life meaning. She fled from him then, the prophecy's words burning behind her eyes. In the cold sanctuary of her chambers, she was once again the cursed girl, her brief time as a queen, nothing more than a prelude to a sacrificial slaughter. The man who had defended her and the man who would destroy her were one and the same, a paradox that tore her soul apart. She stared at the swirling mark on her arm, the supposed key to salvation, and saw only the brand of a lamb being led to the altar. He came to her door, his voice a low, desperate plea through the ancient wood. He did not ask for her forgiveness, for he knew he deserved none. He asked only for time, a chance to defy the fate that had been written for them. "I would see all of Silverwood crumble to dust and be forgotten by time before I let that prophecy claim you," he swore, his voice raw with a pain that mirrored her own. "I just don't know how to stop it." Their agonizing stalemate was shattered by the frantic pealing of the palace bells, a sound reserved for dire emergencies. A royal page, his face pale with panic, delivered the summons. Lord Valerius had convened an emergency session of the council. The withering had advanced with terrifying speed, consuming the sacred heartwood of the Whispering Glade overnight, an event seen as a catastrophic omen. Public terror was mounting. Kaelin had no choice but to face them. As he departed, Elara knew she could not remain hidden. This was her fate being decided. She armored herself in silk and sorrow. her face a mask of impassive royalty, and walked toward the throne room. As the guards swung the great doors open, she saw Kaelin standing alone before the sea of hostile lords. Every eye in the chamber turned to her, and in that moment, Lord Valerius, his expression one of cold triumph, paused his address. A terrible, final pronouncement hung in the air, ready to fall like a guillotine. Lord Valerius turned, his voice a silken blade meant for the entire court. Our king has been keeping a terrible secret. The prophecy he follows is not one of salvation, but of sacrifice. He held up a scroll, a damning duplicate of the one Kaelin possessed. The ancient text is clear. This human conduit must be consumed to fuel the ritual. He brought this blight into our sacred halls, not as a queen, but as a blood offering to be spent for our survival. A collective gasp of horror swept through the chamber. The lords looked from the scroll to Kaelin, their expressions twisting from distrust to revulsion. Ilara felt the world tilt, the public accusation a physical blow. Kaelin was exposed, his desperate gamble laid bare as a monstrous, cold-blooded calculation. He was no longer their king. In their eyes, he was a heretic and a murderer, and she was his chosen victim, standing on a public scaffold. Before the council could erupt into a verdict of treason, Kaelin moved. He did not look at Valerius or the horrified lords. His stormy eyes found Ilara's across the vast hall, and in them she saw not a cornered king, but a man making his final stand. "He is right," Kaelin's voice rang out, clear and resonant, silencing the rising fury. "The prophecy demands a price I was willing to consider. I was willing to use her, to see her as a key, a tool to save us." He took a step toward her, away from his throne, away from his crown. "I was a fool, a king willing to sacrifice the one thing that could make his kingdom worth saving." He stopped before her, his gaze unwavering. "I reject the prophecy. I reject a future bought with her life. I choose her. If Silverwood must fall, let it fall. I will not be the king who reigns over its ashes alone." A profound, shattering silence descended upon the hall. Kaelin had not just abdicated his duty, he had committed the ultimate blasphemy, choosing a cursed human over the survival of his entire race. But for Ilara, his words were the cataclysm that finally broke the foundations of her lifelong prison. The belief that she was unlovable, disposable, a blight upon the world, it all crumbled to dust in the face of his absolute, world-ending choice. A warmth, fierce and brilliant, exploded from the mark on her arm. It was not the unsettling heat of a curse, but the radiant, life-affirming glow of a sun rising after a long night. She stepped forward, no longer a victim or a pawn, and placed her hand on his chest, over his heart. The light from her skin intensified, bathing them both in an ethereal luminescence that stunned the onlookers into breathless awe and terror. "You were all wrong." Ilara's voice, imbued with a power she had never known, filled the chamber. It was not a shout, but it carried to every corner, a sound of pure authority. The prophecy does not speak of death, but of union. It says the conduit will be consumed, not destroyed. Consumed by a bond so absolute it can bridge the worlds of light and shadow. Her gaze swept over the council, fearless and commanding. "The withering was born from your fear, your isolation, your pride. You cannot heal a world by draining another life from it. The magic of this land doesn't demand a sacrifice. It demands a balance." She reached up and took Kaelin's hand, lacing her fingers with his. "It demands a king willing to love what he fears. It demands a love that is more powerful than a crown, more sacred than any ancient law." As their hands clasped, the light erupting from them was no longer a glow, but a wave of palpable, life-giving energy. It surged through the throne room, a warm, verdant wind that carried the scent of wet earth and new blossoms. Faint green moss appeared in the cracks of the ancient obsidian floor, and the withered tapestries hanging on the walls seemed to regain a hint of their vibrant colour. Lord Valerius staggered back, his face a mask of disbelief and fury as the very foundations of his hateful ideology were undone by a miracle. Calen turned to Ilara, his stormy eyes filled with a raw, unguarded love that mirrored the healing magic flowing through the hall. He lowered his head and kissed her, not with the hesitant spark of their wedding, but with the soul-deep certainty of a man who had found his destiny, sealing their true union as the magic of a reborn kingdom bloomed around them. In the seasons that followed, Silverwood awoke from its long, grey slumber. The first green shoots in the heartwood were a cause for celebration, a symbol of a future that had been reclaimed not by sacrifice, but by love. Calen and Ilara ruled not from separate thrones of cold authority, but as two halves of a single whole, their bond, the living heart of the renewed land. They walked hand in hand through gardens where new flowers bloomed, their colours more vibrant than any seen in a generation. The whispers that once followed Ilara were gone, replaced by a reverence for the Shadow Queen who had become their salvation. One evening, as they stood on a balcony overlooking their healing kingdom, she placed his hand on her stomach, a silent promise of the first elven child to be born in a century. Their journey had been forged in pain and shadows, but it had led them to a dawn more beautiful than either had ever dared to dream. Their story is a testament to a love that healed a world, and we hope it has touched your heart as well. Please like this video, comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more tales of love against all odds.